I'm Peter Palmer, and I moved to East Dorset in 1970. It's sort of a long move from Manchester, and that was preceded by a move from Massachusetts. And the beginning of the story is getting out of the service and loving skiing, and decided this was a good place to come to do that. So I first started in Manchester, working all kinds of jobs that ski instructors did in the summertime. Worked at Stratton Mountain in the winter and then did everything. I then managed to put enough of a nest egg together to buy a piece of land on the top of Morse Hill Road in East Dorset. It was a beautiful piece of land with a great view down the valley, and I may have stayed in Manchester, but at the time East Dorset was the place to go. So I built my first house up there, and I say my first house because it was the first house that I actually built. And let's see, at that point, again, jobs were tough. I worked at the Dorset Field Club as the steward at the club, and that was actually a very nice job, and they took very good care of me. That was summertime, and I continued to work and ski at Stratton during the winter. Ian Bennett bought the Equinox House, or actually through partnership with Lewis Marks Jr., and I had been working at Bromley at this point as the director of marketing and also assistant ski school director. And Mr. Bennett invited me to come down to the Equinox and work with him, and I did that. And that was a very exciting year. I was the general manager, actually. Yes, yeah. I was trying to fill Tom Farley's shoes, and I was not particularly good at it, because Tom had been managing the Equinox House for many, many, many years. And with all the big changeover, I would say, in over my head. Well, anyway, I think we were all in over our head in that particular project. The evidence is that it failed. And unfortunately was vacant for a number of years. So through my experience in the ski business, I then went on the road working with Hart Ski Company. And that was interesting and quite rewarding. I was always interested in antiques and old things. And Walter Clemens, who had owned the old tavern for some 30 years, who was a friend, had passed away, and the old tavern became available. So lo and behold, I bought it. I had absolutely not a clue in the world of what I was going to do with it, but I thought it was a great old building, and it should go to a good future. So the last thing in the world I wanted to do was be in the restaurant business, but that's the way it worked out. And I made a deal with myself and my late wife that we would do it for 5 years and then it was over. And it all worked out pretty well. At the end of 5 years, we leased it, continued to own the property, and let's see. Then it was time for something new. I'd done a lot of work on the tavern, physical work in the restoration of the tavern, as well as building my own house and a few other building projects. So I started a company called Historical Projects. And at the time, in the early 80s, was the big condominium boom. And everybody was tearing down old things and building condominiums. Well, I thought maybe it would be fun to try to save the old things. So that's what we did. And for years, that was my life. And well, restoration construction, yes, yeah. Pretty much save the old stuff, crawling through the old basements, jacking them up, fixing them up. And that maybe leads us to this house, the Deming Tavern. When I lived on top of Morse Hill, had often driven down the road, and this old Deming house sat rather forlorn with Frank and Helen Benedict as the residents. Helen was born here and actually passed away here, lived to be well in her 90s. And we called it the Crooked Old House. And it was probably the last place in the world that I ever thought I would end up. But as we went on through, I think it was 1987, working in restoration construction, you had opportunities to buy and sell. And I did buy a piece of land, and it sold rather quickly, and it was quite profitable because everything was fairly profitable in the 80s when it came to real estate. And at that time, there was a gentleman who owned the 1811 house up in Manchester Village, and he had purchased this property to move to Manchester and put out behind the 1811 house for additional rooms. And he contacted me about moving it. And I gave him a price that scared him to death. So he decided that he would abandon the project, and he said, well, why don't you buy it? So it'll be something you could handle. And interestingly enough, he was asking exactly the same amount of money for this as I had just sold that aforementioned piece of land for. And I thought there was, the aliens had something to do with that, because the number was exactly the same. So I said, all right, why not? So I went home and said to my late wife what I had done. And that didn't go over all that well. But anyway, that was 1987. We survived that. Eli Deming and Eliakim Deming. And they came from Wethersfield, Connecticut, about in the mid-1770s. And they were land speculators. And they bought just about everything from what is now the Battenkill Rise Farm, which is Frost's, all the way down to Manchester. And they were in partnership with William Marsh on that. And that's the Marsh Tavern down there at the Equinox House. Well, Marsh was a loyalist, and he went to Canada. And so lo and behold, the Deming brothers picked up William Marsh's piece of the land. And I do understand, and at least rumors have it, that when he came back after the war, he did get some of his land back. But one of the things when I first bought this house and started doing research here, I thought Eli and Eliakim were one and the same, because it seemed that way. And I was wandering through the Factory Point Cemetery one day, and I ran across Eliakim Deming as a Revolutionary War soldier, and some other interesting things on his headstone. And it was Eliakim Deming of Manchester. Well, Eli Deming was clearly East Dorset. And so then we started to dig a little bit, and found that they were actually brothers, not one and the same. And the porch that's directly behind me, the supports of the porch needed a lot of work. So I was digging around under there, and interestingly enough, found the headstone of Eli Deming along with his son Benjamin Deming. We rather speculate that somewhere here in the south end of the property was probably a small family plot. And when Frank Benedict cowed this place, the cows wandered everywhere, and they were pretty notorious for trampling down family plots. And as that happened, and especially knowing Frank, if he needed a piece of marble to stick under the porch, it was most likely that he would go to the easiest source, which was probably the cemetery. I'm only speculating, but probably the cemetery. So, as they say, there's a lot of stuff buried around here. I mentioned the railroad coming through here in 1853, and that might have greatly affected this particular house. The house was built in 1786, and it was primarily initially built as a cape, sort of a story-and-a-half cape, and it was, I think, about 36, 38 feet by 28 feet. And as business grew in East Dorset, it became a tavern, and Benjamin Deming put a fairly large addition on the south side with a great big room above, which was a ballroom, and a single room down below, which was sort of you'd say probably an eating hall and so on and so forth, but also added another huge chimney to it. At the same time, they excavated under part of the original building to create cellar space under there. And that was probably done about 1810 to 1815. And it all worked well until the railroad came through in 1853, and the trains went by and shook the ground. And because we're sitting on gravel here, the chimney base had been dug in close to on the south side, so the gravel slid away from under the chimney, and it's a 10-foot square large marble chimney, and the chimney tipped to the south because the base had been taken out from under it. And as the chimney tipped to the south, the whole building went with it about 4 or 5 inches. So it has a pretty good lean to the south. And then over the years, of course, when I came here and started the restoration of rebuilding the chimneys and rebuilding a lot of the foundation and different parts of the house, so much of the interior over 150 years had been sort of built plumb. So if we moved the house back plumb, then all of a sudden everything inside would have leaned 4 inches to the north. So the best thing to do was sort of let it be. So it has still its 4-inch lean to the south, but it's good and solid, and it's not going to go south anymore. When another little addendum, when the Benedicts lived here, the north side of the house is very cool in the summertime, and the south side of the house is nice and warm in the winter because it has south windows and good sun coming in there. So the Benedicts would always say that they'd go up north in the summertime, and then they'd head down south in the winter. And they would move, so there was a kitchen in the south end and a kitchen in the north end, and that was their idea of moving north and south. And maybe that's sort of is that sort of a Vermont thing, Michelle? Some people go further, but not the Benedicts. Oh yeah, the carriage house out here, the open-ended carriage shed, that came from the Hadwin farm in Danby. George Hadwin built that in about 1800, and that's right on Route 7 on the Danby South Wallingford line. And that was rather a dilapidated and forlorn building. This particular building in 1987 and up through until I moved that carriage house there, looked sort of like it fell out of an airplane, because these old farmhouses need companion buildings. They need dependencies, and this needed one badly. So that just seemed to be a natural for that to go there. And then over to my right, which we probably can't see, anyway, that's an outhouse that came from Mount Nebo in Eagle Bridge, New York. And Mount Nebo happened to be the home of Grandma Moses. I was friends with Tom Moses, a grandnephew, and he called me up one day because I, in my historical projects times, collected outhouses. Lots of people wanted them for tool sheds. You know, they were quite funky. And so Tom used to find these things for me around New York State. And he called me up and he said, "Hey, you want Grandma's outhouse?" And I said, "Grandma who?" And he said, "Grandma Moses, my grandmother." And I thought, well, that would be pretty interesting. So lo and behold, a couple of days later, the outhouse shows up. And so now the Mount Nebo outhouse is part of the Deming Tavern. Yeah, East Dorset. Well, it's sort of, I'll regress a bit. When I was at the field club as the steward, someone said, when I was building my house on top of Morse Hill Road, they said, "I understand you're building in Dorset." And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Where is it?" And I said, "Well, on top of Morse Hill Road." And they said, "Oh, that's not Dorset." And I said, "Really? What's that?" And they said, "That's East Dorset." So I guess there's some fine line there that I wasn't really aware of at the time, but East Dorset's a wonderful place. Of course, you know, there are a bunch of farmers over there in Dorset, and of course when the railroad came through here in 1853 and the marble was booming, this was the place to be over here. This is where the action was, and I guess the summer rusticators were over there, and the farmers were over there, and all the business was over here. Well, you know, it's a wonderful place with the folks over here are nice. It's a great place to be. The pond is beautiful, and that's about it.